December 1944, a snow-covered field in Belgium. Over 80 American soldiers lay dead in the dirt, shot in cold blood by men who wore the lightning bolt insignia of the SS. The world would come to know this as the Malmedy Massacre. The world would also come to know the man who commanded the column, Joachim Peiper, who was tried, convicted, and eventually walked free. But Peiper was not the only man there. Standing in the shadows of that killing field was another officer, a man who gave orders, a man who watched, a man whose name almost never appears in the history books because he made sure of it. His name was Georg Preuss, and unlike Peiper, he didn't just escape the hangman. He escaped history entirely. To understand how a man disappears after a massacre, you first have to understand how he was built. Georg Preuss was not a myth like Peiper. He wasn't on propaganda posters. He wasn't handed medals by Hitler. He was something more dangerous than famous. He was competent, quiet, and forgettable. Exactly the kind of officer the SS relied on to make things happen without leaving fingerprints. Born in 1914, Preuss came of age in a Germany being reshaped by the Nazi Party. He was not a reluctant soldier swept up in history. He volunteered. He joined the Waffen-SS as a young man and worked his way up through the ranks with steady, unremarkable efficiency. He was the kind of man who completed his orders and filed his reports and never drew attention to himself. By 1944, he had earned a command position inside Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, hand-selected for Hitler's last great offensive in the West, the Ardennes counteroffensive, what the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge. On the morning of December 16, 1944, Kampfgruppe Peiper rolled west out of Germany with a simple, brutal mission. Move fast, don't stop, reach the Meuse River. Speed was everything. Peiper had been told not to worry about prisoners. That message, spoken and unspoken, ran through every officer in that column. Preuss commanded one of the subordinate elements in the column. His unit moved with the same ruthless momentum as the rest. In the villages they passed through, civilians hid in cellars. American stragglers were cut down where they stood. Then came the Bonnier crossroads, outside the town of Malmedy. A convoy of American soldiers from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion had the misfortune of driving into the column's path. They were lightly armed. They had no chance. They were stopped, disarmed, and herded into a snowy field at the side of the road. There were over 100 of them. And then the SS opened fire. The men who survived did so by falling and playing dead in the blood-soaked snow. They lay there for hours. They listened to the SS soldiers walking among them, firing pistol shots into the skulls of the wounded. 84 American prisoners died that afternoon. The officers of Kampfgruppe Peiper knew what had happened. They had either given the order, passed the order, or said nothing when the order was carried out. Georg Preuss was part of that command structure. When the column finally moved on, it left behind not just the dead, it left behind witnesses. Men who had pressed their faces into the frozen ground and memorized what they saw. Men who would eventually testify. In 1946, the United States convened the Malmedy war crimes trial at Dachau. 73 members of Kampfgruppe Peiper were brought before American military judges. The charges were murder. The evidence was survivors. The testimonies were damning. Joachim Peiper received the death sentence. Many others received long prison terms. But the trial was imperfect. It was rushed. The American military legal system was strained. Not every officer who belonged in that courtroom ended up in one. Some had vanished before they could be apprehended. Some had given false names. Some had simply slipped into the chaos of a collapsing Germany and ceased to exist on paper. Georg Preuss was among those who slipped through. When the war ended, Germany became a country of ghosts. Millions of displaced people, bombed-out cities, shattered records. For a man who wanted to vanish, the conditions were almost perfect. Preuss had something that many war criminals lacked: discipline. He didn't flee to South America like some of the famous names. He didn't try to build a new life in Syria or Egypt. He did something quieter. He stayed. He blended in. He became, on paper, an ordinary German citizen. He found civilian employment. He lived under his real name, but in a country so overwhelmed with denazification proceedings and reconstruction that individual cases fell through the cracks. American investigators had lists of names, but they also had overwhelmed dockets and competing political pressures as the Cold War reshaped priorities. By the early 1950s, Georg Preuss was effectively invisible. Preuss was not the only man protected by circumstance. He was protected by history itself. As the 1950s progressed, the West German government pushed back hard against Allied war crimes prosecutions. They argued the trials were unfair. They argued confessions had been coerced. They argued that the new West Germany needed to move forward, not look backward. American politicians agreed. The Cold War demanded a strong, rearmed West Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. You do not build a military alliance by putting your allies' soldiers on trial. The American government commuted death sentences, shortened prison terms, opened prison gates. The men who had served partial sentences for Malmedy walked free, one by one, and rejoined civilian life. For a man like Preuss, who had never been convicted at all, this political climate was a guarantee. No one was going to reopen the case. No one was going to come looking. Georg Preuss lived the rest of his life in West Germany. He was not hunted. He was not tried. He was not named at Nuremberg. He was not featured in the documentaries. He aged quietly. He died quietly. The survivors of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, the men who lay in that Belgian snow and listened to their friends being shot. Some of them lived into old age themselves. Some of them spent decades trying to make the world remember what happened at that crossroads. For them, justice was not a courtroom verdict. It was acknowledgement. It was the world knowing what was done to their fellow soldiers and who did it. For Georg Preuss, acknowledgement never came. He was a man who committed crimes in the company of more famous criminals, and when the cameras found those criminals, he simply stepped out of the frame. Joachim Peiper became a symbol. His name is in every book about the Battle of the Bulge. His trial is studied in law schools. His death, burned alive in France in 1976, became a story of grim, violent closure. But history is full of Georg Preusses, men who stood in the same fields, gave the same orders, watched the same murders, and then went home. Men who were not famous enough to be hunted, not notorious enough to make a newspaper headline, not important enough for a war crimes tribunal to prioritize. They are the reason the Malmedy Massacre was not the act of one man. They are the reason the no prisoners culture spread through that column like fire through dry wood. They are the reason 84 Americans died in a Belgian field and went home in boxes instead of on troop ships. The famous names get the trials. The famous names get the verdicts, and sometimes the karma. The men in the shadows get nothing except exactly what they wanted: a quiet life. The Malmedy Massacre is remembered today as one of the worst atrocities committed against American soldiers in the European theater of World War II. 84 men, a snowy field, an SS column in a hurry. Joachim Peiper's name is on every memorial, but behind him, in that column, were dozens of other men, officers, commanders, men with names. Most of them are forgotten, not because they were innocent, but because they were careful. If this story of the men history left behind moved you, share it. And if you want to see what happened to the SS commander who was not forgotten, who was tracked down 30 years later and burned alive in his own home, that video is right here. Thanks for watching.